Okay, something interesting I found out about the Gospels today, or yesterday really, that I wanted to share, and is related to things that originally made me think that they were actually, there's some validity to it, which is that, okay, for those who don't know, there are four Gospels up here: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, and there's the epistles, which are the other books in the Bible, in the New Testament. However, there are since the 20th century, there have been attempts to date when each of these were written that are not the internal source themselves, right? So, like, mostly German theologians and German archaeologists tried to find the earliest versions of these books, tried to use modern methods to determine, like, the year that these were written. Okay. And a lot of these early Gospels mention Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, which happens in 70 CE. And so a lot of skeptical archaeologists have dated all of these books, at least to having been written after 70 CE, right? Because especially if they don't actually believe Jesus legitimately predicted that the temple would be destroyed, right? Okay, it's got to be after, because they put it in that the temple gets destroyed. Okay, so it's in this period here, which is related to how this guy here, St. Ignatius, is a disciple of John, who claims to have written this book. And St. Ignatius dies in 108, and we have a bunch of his writings. And in his writings, he references a bunch of lines from some of the Gospels. Some people have said that this could potentially be because he was seeing, like, pre-written versions of it. Of course, he literally talked to John, so if he cites portions of the Bible, maybe he just literally heard John say them before they were compiled by other people who knew John, or maybe St. Ignatius didn't know John. We don't know. Okay, but St. Ignatius claims to know John and cites words that eventually end up in John and Luke's Gospels, I believe. Okay, so 108 is probably the boundary out here. And so this period is usually where they write the dating of the Gospels. And the interesting side note is that the epistles, which are written mostly by Paul, who claims to have been thrown off his horse like right around here and received Jesus, are usually attributed to being written right about here, for a number of reasons. One, they don't really cite anything other than the most famous lines that Jesus says, so it's likely that someone at some point told Paul that Jesus said something. And of course, Paul never even claims to have been here when Jesus was crucified, so he doesn't really cite any of the same stuff that the Gospels talk about a whole lot. So they can comfortably be written around here. He doesn't talk about the destruction of the temple. However, Luke is accompanied by one other book that doesn't fit neatly into the category of the Gospels and the epistles. It's a book called Acts, which Luke also writes. Luke is usually considered to be the last of the Gospel writers because of a way of writing. These are the synoptic Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason they're called the synoptic Gospels is because they're weirdly the exact same. Early theologians have mentioned this. Medieval historians who weren't trying to, delegitimize the books have realized, they have like the exact same lines as the other ones. And so a lot of modern historians have said, okay, we can date that Mark was probably the earliest. It's the shortest, and it includes the least amount of stuff. And the general principle for religious texts and dating them, not just Christian religious texts, is that usually theologians and people that are doctoring texts are more comfortable adding stuff than taking it out. You can see this when you look at other religions and their religious texts and the older versions versus the newer versions that we have. Okay, so Mark has the least, so he's probably the oldest. Okay, and Matthew and Luke cite Mark, probably. If Mark's the oldest, then that's the source of these quotes. But they also both cite another source, which is usually called Q, for a German word, which these are all citing. And then this one goes here. Okay. And so Q is probably a list of sayings, because most of the stuff that they both cite are like actually quotes from Jesus that they don't have in Mark, but they both also have. Or some people have said maybe Mark wrote Mark and then Matthew wrote Luke, and then Luke was kind of the last. But Luke includes the most stuff of all of them. So even if maybe Matthew isn't citing Q, but Luke is citing Matthew and Q and all of these other sayings, Gospels, that we don't have today. All these other sources. Luke also doesn't claim to have actually met Jesus in his Gospel. Mark and Matthew do. Luke opens up his gospel saying, inasmuch as I'm able of reciting all of the histories here, lots of other people have tried to put the gospel together and recite this time period, but this is the concept that I've gotten from all of them. So even Luke kind of says, look, I had lots of sources. I'm kind of at the end here. I'm just going to compile them all together. Okay. And so Luke's gospel includes the prediction of the destruction of the temple. Okay. However, Luke doesn't just write Luke's gospel. Luke also writes the book called Acts, which takes place here and includes characters like Paul and Peter and the apostles after Jesus' resurrection and them starting the church. Okay. But if Luke is citing all of these older sources, and these older sources and Luke have the destruction of the temple as a prediction, then Luke must be writing after the destruction of the temple, right, about all this stuff in Acts. However, Acts, you would think, would include the destruction of the temple if it was being written after. It is what Luke is basically saying, a history of the church so far, except it ends way before the destruction of the temple and just talks a lot about some of the controversies that were happening right after the church occurred. And if Luke was writing in this period, there were different controversies than what were happening here. For instance, here people were concerned, do we still circumcise people? Do we still keep kosher? But over here, people were more worried about was Jesus 100% God? Or was Jesus 50-50? Or was Jesus not God? Or was Jesus totally God and his body was an illusion? Those were the controversies that were happening then. We know that because of other histories and archaeology and things. But Luke doesn't write about those things. He writes about the stuff that's going on here and how they settled all this stuff. So, taking all that into consideration, especially with the fact that St. Ignatius cites all these people, John's gospel is definitely maybe even later than Luke. And so if John's is later than Luke, did they all write in 4 years over here, or did they all spread out mostly? Why would all of these 4 gospel writers write their versions without knowing about the other, but with including the same stuff? John makes sense if John knew about all these other ones and he wanted to include stuff that wasn't in these, because a lot of John is not in these and they're not shared at all. They talk about completely different things, Jesus' early life and other things. So it makes more sense that these guys were writing about the same time and this guy was writing after them, trying to fill in the gaps. Okay. Taking all of that together, it seems to me like Luke was writing before the destruction of the temple. And Mark and Matthew then had to be writing shortly after. In fact, Mark and Matthew claim to be characters that witnessed Jesus' death and resurrection. And of course, it is possible, and lots of secular historians will point this out. We're not saying that these guys didn't actually write the books. Over here, they might still be alive. But given the lifespan of people that lived at the time, it's not likely. Church history says that John lived to be about 90. So he probably could have lived to about here, and that would make sense with St. Ignatius dying in 108. And St. Ignatius claiming to be a disciple of John. It all kind of does add up in the end, in both senses. However, what seems more likely to me is that Mark, who has the earliest version of the prophecies of the destruction of the temple, is writing before John, and before Luke, and before Matthew, and even maybe contemporaneous with Q, okay? And it ends up here, or in this space. And that includes a genuine prediction of the destruction of the temple that actually does happen in 70 CE.